There is an hour of the night the church has never spoken of lightly, not midnight, not dawn. A narrow window, somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, that ancient monks called the hour of greatest darkness. 2. And if you have ever woken suddenly in that hour, heart pounding, room silent, no reason you can name, I need you to listen to what I am about to tell you, because it is not an accident. For centuries, cloistered religious have risen in the deep of night, not at dawn, not at a reasonable hour, but in the black stillness before sunrise, to pray matins, to stand watch. Ask any monk why. Pooh, and he will not talk about tradition. He will talk about warfare. He will tell you that the hours before light are not empty. They are contested. Scripture itself marks this time with unease. 2. The Gospels tell us Christ agonized in the garden through the night, sweating blood, while his apostles could not stay awake, as if something in that hour worked to close their eyes. Psalms speak of the terror of the night and the arrow that flies by day as two different things, two different enemies. One seen, one not. So what happens in that hour? 2. Why do hospitals report more deaths near it than any other time? Why do the Desert Fathers, the mystics, the exorcists across centuries, different eras, different continents, no communication between them, all point to the same narrow stretch of darkness? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never look at that hour of the night the same way again. Before we continue, 2. Subscribe to Ripperger Insights and turn on notifications, because these powerful messages are meant for those who seek truth and deeper understanding. The hour no one speaks of long before science. Before clocks divided the night into equal hours, the men and women who gave their lives entirely to prayer already knew something the rest of the world did not. They knew that not all darkness is the same darkness. Walk into any Trappist monastery today, and you will find monks rising while the world sleeps. Not at 5, not at 6, but often earlier, into that deep well of night when even nocturnal creatures grow still. 2. They call it vigils. Some call it matins. And if you ask an old monk why the church built an entire office of prayer around this specific stretch of night, he will not shrug and say tradition for tradition's sake. 2. He will lower his voice, and he will tell you, because something moves in that hour. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 2. Because we live in an age that has convinced us the world is fully explained, that darkness is simply the absence of light, nothing more, nothing hidden within it. But the saints did not believe that. 2. The Desert Fathers, who fled into the wilderness of Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries specifically to do battle with the enemy, did not believe that. They wrote extensively of demons who attacked most fiercely not at midnight, not at dawn, but in that narrow, aching stretch before the sky begins to change. 2. They called it the noonday devil's twin, a darkness that presses on the soul precisely when the body is weakest, when the mind is most alone, when resistance is lowest. Think now of the Garden of Gethsemane. Scripture tells us that Christ went there in the deep of night, taking Peter, James, and John with him, and he said to them, "My soul is sorrowful even unto death. Stay here and watch with me." And what happened? They fell asleep. Not once. 3 times he returned to find them sleeping, unable to keep their eyes open, even as their Lord sweat blood in agony only steps away. Ask yourself, why? These were fishermen, grown men, no strangers to long nights on the water. Why, in the presence of the Son of God agonizing before them, could they not stay awake? Some of the fathers of the church suggest something unsettling, that it was not ordinary exhaustion that closed their eyes that night. That the same darkness pressing upon Christ was, in some mysterious way, pressing upon them too, dulling them, drawing a veil over their spirits at the exact moment they were most needed. 2. If that is true, if there is a spiritual weight to certain hours of the night that can act upon the soul even without our awareness, then what does that mean for you, waking suddenly at 3 in the morning, heart racing, for no reason you can explain? The Psalms do not let us dismiss this lightly either. Psalm 91, a psalm so associated with spiritual protection that it has been prayed by soldiers, exorcists, and the dying for 2,000 years, draws a very deliberate distinction. Thou shalt not be afraid of the terror of the night, of the arrow that flieth in the day. Read that again slowly. Two different threats. Two different natures of attack. One that flies visibly in daylight, that can be seen and dodged and understood, and one that comes in the terror of the night, unseen, formless. Striking not the body but something deeper. Why would the psalmist bother to separate them if they were the same thing? This is where I need you to stay with me. Because what I'm about to walk through is not superstition, and it is not fear for the sake of fear. It is something the church has quietly held on to for 2,000 years. Something written into her very liturgy. Something exorcists across centuries and across continents, men who never met each other, who spoke different languages, who lived in different centuries, have all, independently, pointed toward the same conclusion. There is a reason cloistered religious pray through the night. There is a reason ancient monasteries built their entire rhythm of life around rising in the hours before dawn to stand as spiritual sentries. They were not simply disciplining their bodies. They believed and taught that the night has watches, the way a besieged city has watches. And that someone must be awake and praying while the rest of the world sleeps defenseless. And if that is true, then ask yourself the question that should be sitting in your chest right now. Who is standing watch for you? Because most of us are not monks. We do not rise at 3 a.m. to chant psalms in a cold stone chapel. We sleep defenseless through the very hour tradition tells us is most contested, and we wake sometimes with our hearts pounding, in a silence that feels somehow occupied, and we tell ourselves it was nothing, just a dream, just stressance. Just the body doing what bodies do. But what if it isn't just that? What if the ancient wisdom of the church, the vigils, the psalms, the desert fathers, the warnings passed down through centuries of men who wrestled with darkness directly? What if all of it was trying to tell us something that we, in our modern comfort, have simply stopped listening to? Stay with me, because in the next part, I want to show you exactly what the church believed was happening in that hour, and why the answer is far stranger and far more hopeful than you might expect. The watches of the night to understand why the church built her prayer around this hour. You have to go back further than the monasteries. You have to go back to the way the ancient world itself understood the night. In the time of Christ, the night was not one undivided stretch of darkness. It was divided into watches, set periods, each with its own name, each guarded by a soldier whose duty was to stay alert while the city around him slept. The Gospel of Mark records Christ himself using this structure when he warns his disciples to be ready, saying they do not know when the master of the house will come, at even, or at midnight, or at the cock crowing, or in the morning. 4 watches, 4 distinct segments of vigilance carved out of the dark. Why does this matter? Because the early church did not discard this structure, she baptized it. She took the pagan world's practical division of night watches and transformed it into something sacred. To the divine office, prayed at set hours through day and night, a chain of prayer that never breaks, hour to hour, monastery to monastery, century to century. And of all those hours, one carried a weight the others did not. The watch just before the cockcrow, the deepest hour, the hour when the body's defenses are lowest, when sleep is heaviest, when the mind is furthest from waking reason. This is the hour the monks called vigils. Vigil, from the Latin vigia, meaning watchfulness, meaning someone is awake so that evil does not move unchallenged. Now, I want to ask you something. And I want you to actually sit with the question rather than rushing past it. Why would a church that teaches Christ has already conquered sin and death? Why would that same church insist, century after century, generation after generation, that someone must remain physically awake, praying through the darkest hour of night? The answer the fathers give us is not comfortable. It is this: victory has been won, but the battle has not ended. Christ's triumph on the cross broke the power of darkness permanently, but Scripture is clear that darkness has not yet been fully silenced in this world. St. Peter himself writes it plainly, and I want you to hear the weight of his words. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Be vigilant. The very word the monks built their night prayer around. Peter is not describing an abstract, symbolic danger. He is describing a walking, seeking, prowling reality, one that does not rest simply because the world has gone to sleep. And where does a lion hunt? Not in daylight, when prey is alert and watching. A lion hunts in the dark, too, when the herd's guard is down. This is why, across cultures and centuries, the deep night carries such a universal weight of dread that even secular medicine has had to acknowledge it without being able to explain it. 2. Hospitals have long observed what nurses call the witching hour of mortality, a measurable spike in deaths occurring in the hours before dawn, more than at any other point in the 24-hour cycle. 2. Doctors will offer you biological explanations, cortisol levels, circadian rhythms, the body's lowest point of physiological resilience. And those explanations are not wrong. But ask yourself, why would the body itself, across every culture, every era, be built to reach its weakest ebb in precisely the hour the Church has, for 2,000 years, called the hour of spiritual battle? 2. Coincidence explains a pattern once. It does not explain a pattern that repeats across medicine, scripture, monastic tradition, and the testimony of exorcists who have never read each other's work. I think of the words of Christ in the garden one more time, because they will not leave me alone. Could ye not watch with me 1 hour? He asked Peter, not accusing, but almost grieving. 1 hour. 2. That is all he asked. And they could not give it because something in that hour worked against them even as they tried. If the apostles, men who had walked with Christ, who had seen him raise the dead, 2, who loved him enough to draw swords in his defense hours later, could not stay awake through that 1 hour of trial, what makes us think we are simply exempt? Sleeping unguarded through it every single night of our lives? This is not meant to frighten you into paralysis. I need you to hear that clearly. 2, because that is not what the saints intended when they rose in the dark to pray. They did not rise because they were terrified. They rose because they understood something we have largely forgotten. That vigilance is not fear, it is love standing guard. A mother does not check on her sleeping child at 3 a.m. because she is consumed with dread. She does it because she loves that child enough to remain aware, even when awareness costs her sleep. That is what vigils was. That is what the whole night office of the Church still is, prayed today in monasteries scattered across the world while the rest of us sleep. It is love. 2, keeping watch. But here is the question I need you to carry into the next part with me, because it is the question that changes everything. If the saints believed this hour required a guard, 2, and if fewer and fewer people today even know these prayers exist, who exactly is back to the men who first went looking for the answer themselves? 2, not theologians in comfortable studies. Men who left everything, walked into the Egyptian desert with nothing, and waited for the darkness to come to them on purpose. 2, the desert fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries were not gentle men living quiet lives of contemplation, the way we sometimes imagine monks today. They were spiritual soldiers who had gone looking for a fight. 2, St. Anthony of Egypt, the father of Christian monasticism, is recorded by his biographer Athanasius as enduring nights of such violent spiritual assault that he was later found by companions beaten and barely alive. Not by any human hand, but by something his own body bore the marks of in the dead of night, alone in his cell. Athanasius does not dress this up as metaphor. He writes it as history, as something that happened in the dark to a man who had done nothing but pray. Why does this matter to you, sitting wherever you are right now, centuries removed from an Egyptian desert cell? Because Anthony did not simply endure this and move on. 2, he studied it. He and the fathers who came after him began to notice patterns, that certain hours brought certain kinds of attack, that the mind grew weary and vulnerable to despair and terror in specific, repeatable windows of the night, most severely in the hours before dawn. They gave this a name that has survived in spiritual literature for over 1,000 years. Acedia. 2, sometimes called the noonday devil for its daytime form, but recognized in its nighttime form as something heavier still, a spirit of dread, of hopelessness, of accusation that presses hardest when a person is most alone and most tired. Think about the last time you woke suddenly in the deep of night, and your mind, before you could stop it, went immediately to your worst fear, a regret you thought you'd buried, a relationship you'd failed, a sin you thought you'd left behind long ago, suddenly vivid again, accusing you in a silence that felt somehow deliberate. You have likely told yourself this was simply anxiety, the mind idling without distraction, and it may well be exactly that. 2, but the Desert Fathers would ask you to consider something further. They taught that the accuser, and Scripture itself names Satan this way, ho diabolos, the one who throws a cross, the one who accuses, does his most effective work not through spectacle, but through whispers, timed precisely to our weakest moments. Revelation 12 tells us he is the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, not resting. Ask yourself honestly, when in your life have accusing thoughts against yourself felt loudest? For most people, if they are honest, the answer is the same. Not at noon, surrounded by the business of the day, in the dark, alone, early. This is precisely why the fathers structured monastic life the way they did. Not out of superstition, but out of hard-won, repeated experience. They discovered that prayer offered in that hour did something. It did not merely comfort the one praying. It seemed to break something. 2, to hold a line that would otherwise be overrun. St. John Cassian, who studied under these very desert fathers and later brought their teaching to the West, 2, wrote extensively about the necessity of vigilance precisely because he had seen and experienced what happened in its absence. And this is where I want to bring you back to Scripture one final time in this part, because there is a detail in the Gospels that is so easy to read past, and yet it may be the most important detail of all. When Peter denies Christ 3 times in the courtyard of the high priest. 2, Scripture tells us with striking precision that it happened as the night wore toward dawn, and immediately after his 3rd denial, the cock crew. 2, the rooster's call marks the boundary of that final watch, the very watch the monks would later call vigils, the hour of deepest darkness before light returns. Peter's greatest failure, his most devastating collapse, happens in that hour, not at midday, in the crowd, under scrutiny, in the dark, exhausted, afraid, alone in a way that had nothing to do with the people around him. Is that a coincidence? Ask yourself honestly. Peril, 2. The same apostle who could not stay awake to pray with Christ in the garden a few hours earlier is the same apostle who, hours later, in that same deep night window, denies him 3 times before the rooster's cry breaks the darkness. Twice in one night, in the very hours the church would later structure her prayer around, Peter fails, not from a lack of love. 2, he loved Christ enough to draw a sword for him. He fails because something in that hour worked against his strength precisely when his strength was lowest. 2. If it happened to Peter, the rock on which Christ built his church, what makes any of us think we are somehow beyond its reach? This is not despair I am handing you. It is a map. 2. The Desert Fathers did not simply identify the danger and stop there. They discovered the answer. And in the next part, 2, I want to show you exactly what that answer was, because it changes everything about how you should think of the hour you wake, alone in the dark. 2, the answer hidden in the darkness told you at the end of the last part that this was not despair I was handing you. It was a map. So let me show you where that map leads. Because the Desert Fathers who suffered so violently in the dark did not simply catalog their wounds and walk away defeated. They found something, too. And what they found is so simple that the modern mind, trained to expect complexity, almost refuses to believe it could be enough. The answer was presence, not cleverness. Not a formula of words repeated like a charm. Presence, the deliberate, disciplined choice to remain spiritually awake and turn toward God precisely in the hour the enemy hoped to find them turned away. St. Anthony, after his most violent nights of assault, did not flee the desert. He stayed. And tradition holds that after one of his fiercest trials, when he had been left broken on the floor of his cell, a light filled the space and he heard, or understood in prayer, that Christ had been present all along, watching, and had allowed the trial to test him, waiting for the moment Anthony would cry out. "Where were you?" Anthony is said to have asked. And the answer he received was not an excuse. It was a promise. "I was here, watching your struggle. Because you did not give in, I will be your helper forever." 2, hold that phrase for a moment. I was here, not absent, not indifferent to the hour, present, watching even in the deepest dark, and waiting not to prevent the struggle, but to be sought within it. 2, this is the theological heart of everything the church built around the night watches. Christ does not promise his followers a life free of the dark hour. He promises himself within it. Remember what the psalmist himself wrote after naming the terror of the night. He did not end there in dread. He continued, "For he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways." 2. Protection is promised in the very psalm that names the danger. The two are inseparable in Scripture, the acknowledgement of the threat and the assurance of a guard set against it. This is why the monastic office of vigils was never framed by the church as an act of fear. It was framed as an act of love returned. Christ asked his apostles in Gethsemane, "Could ye not watch with me 1 hour?" 2. And for 2,000 years, in monasteries scattered across every continent, men and women have risen in the coldest, darkest part of the night, specifically to answer that question with a yes that the apostles, in their exhaustion, could not give. Every night, somewhere in the world, someone is keeping the watch Peter, James, and John could not keep. The chain has never fully broken. 2. But what does this mean for you? Someone who is not a monk, who does not rise for vigils, who simply finds themselves awake in that hour by accident, heart pounding, mind racing toward fear before you're even fully conscious. Here is what the tradition would tell you, and I want you to receive it not as a rule, but as an invitation. That waking is not meaningless. 2. Whether it comes from stress, from the body's chemistry, from nothing you can name, the moment you find yourself alert in that hour is an opportunity the saints would have recognized immediately. Not a moment to fear, but a moment to turn. Even a single line of prayer, "Jesus, I trust in you," or simply the sign of the cross made slowly, deliberately, in the dark, was understood by the fathers as an act of tremendous spiritual weight, precisely because it is offered at the hour when offering it costs the most. Prayer prayed easily, in comfort, in daylight, is good. But prayer prayed in that hour, against exhaustion, against fear, against the temptation to simply roll over and let dread win, that prayer the tradition holds is prayer of a different order entirely. Consider the widow's mite. Christ tells his disciples that the poor widow who gave 2 small coins gave more than all the wealthy who gave from their abundance, because she gave of her want, even all her living. 2. The hour of deepest night operates the same way, spiritually speaking. A prayer offered from exhaustion, from fear, from the very depth of human weakness, is not a lesser prayer because it is difficult to give. 2. It is a greater one because it costs everything the person has left. This is why the fathers did not merely endure the night hour, they came to treasure it. St. John Climacus, too, writing centuries later in his Ladder of Divine Ascent, describes the tears and the struggle of nighttime prayer not as punishment, but as purification. A furnace in which the soul is refined precisely because nothing else is watching, nothing else is applauding. No one else will ever know what was fought and won in that hour except God alone. And here, I think, too, is the deepest truth hidden inside this ancient teaching, the one I want you to carry forward with you. The hour that seems to expose your weakness most is the very hour God has chosen, across every century of the Church's life, to draw closest to those who call to Him, not despite the darkness within it. But knowing this raises a harder question, one the saints themselves wrestled with for years before finding peace. If God is present in that hour, waiting to be sought, why does He allow the terror to come at all? 2. Why not simply remove the trial rather than stand within it? That is where we must go next. Because the answer the Church gives is not what you expect, and it may be the most important truth in this entire message. Why God allows the darkness? Why does God allow the terror of the night at all? If He is sovereign, if He